What would you do if someone you trusted was being treated unfairly right in front of you, and you were the only one who could help? This is the story of a bus driver, loved by every child he took safely home each day, who faced an unexpected challenge one afternoon that would put his kindness and patience to the test. But what happened next wasn't about him alone. It was about the students who, in that moment, decided to stand together and do something unforgettable. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments below. It was a sunny afternoon, and the school day had finally ended. Mr. Harass, the school bus driver, wore his usual warm smile as he helped each child onto the bus, greeting them with a cheerful, "Hello, champ," or "How's it going, sunshine?" He was the kind of driver who remembered birthdays, who asked about pets, and who listened to each kid's stories as if they were the most important things in the world. To the children, he wasn't just a driver. He was a friend, a protector, a kind face they trusted every single day. Inside the bus, laughter and chatter filled the air. Friends swapped stories about their day, shared secrets, and planned games for the weekend. It was a typical ride, one they looked forward to every day. Mr. Harass smiled as he watched them through the rearview mirror. He loved his job, loved seeing the kids happy and safe. Nothing unusual or alarming seemed like it could happen that afternoon. But then, just as they turned onto the main road, something unusual happened. From behind, the blaring sound of a siren cut through the laughter, immediately catching everyone's attention. Red and blue lights flashed brightly in the rearview mirror. A police car was speeding up behind the bus, its lights reflecting off every window. The bus became so silent that you could hear a pin drop. Every pair of eyes turned to the back of the bus, looking out the windows, trying to understand what was happening. The lights were bright, almost blinding, and the siren was loud, bouncing off the walls of the bus like an echo in a cave. Mr. Harass's warm smile faded, replaced by a look of concern as he glanced at the rearview mirror. Then, as calmly as he could, he gently pulled the bus to the side of the road. One child, a third grader named Benji, whispered to his friend, "Why are the police stopping Mr. Harass?" His friend Sarah shrugged, looking just as confused. Neither of them could understand why the police would pull over a school bus of all things, especially when the driver was someone as kind and gentle as Mr. Harass. The children didn't know it, but Mr. Harass felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He had always followed every rule, was careful on every turn, and made sure every child was safe and secure before he even started the engine. But in his heart, he had a feeling that something wasn't right. Still, he turned to the children and gave them a small, reassuring smile. "Stay in your seats, everyone," he said gently, his voice calm but slightly strained. "I'll be right back. Everything is okay. Don't worry." The kids nodded, but their faces told a different story. They felt the nervous energy hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Their favorite driver, the man who made them laugh and feel safe, was now being pulled over by the police, and none of them knew why. Some of the younger kids started to fidget, clutching their backpacks a little tighter, while others exchanged worried glances, whispering in hushed voices. Mr. Harass opened the door and slowly stepped out of the bus. The children watched as he walked toward the police car, where 2 officers were waiting. He kept his hands visible, moving cautiously as he approached. The children couldn't hear what was being said, but they could see Mr. Harass talking to the officers, his expression serious yet respectful. One officer pointed at the bus, and Mr. Harass glanced back, his eyes scanning the faces pressed against the windows. He tried to keep his expression calm and collected, but there was a flicker of worry in his eyes that the kids could see. The older children, like 12-year-old Jordan, began to sense that this wasn't just a normal traffic stop. Something didn't feel right. Then suddenly, one of the officers spoke to Mr. Harass in a loud, stern voice that even the children could hear through the closed bus windows. "We received a call about this vehicle. We're going to need to see some identification and ask you a few questions," the officer said. The children couldn't believe what they were hearing. Why would anyone call the police on Mr. Harris? One girl whispered to her friend, "He's the nicest person ever." The whispers grew louder as more children started asking questions, all of them worried, confused and scared. They could see Mr. Harris calmly handing over his identification, answering questions with a respectful nod. But as the officers continued talking, the kids could tell that something was wrong. The way the officers moved, the tone of their voices, it felt wrong, unfair. Back inside the bus, Sarah, one of the older kids, was sitting up straight, her eyes glued to the scene unfolding outside. She clenched her fists, feeling a mixture of fear and frustration. She knew Mr. Harris wasn't in trouble. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just their driver, their friend. But here he was, standing by the road, facing questions and stern looks from the police. One of the younger kids, Benji, started to sniffle, his big eyes filling with tears. "Are they going to take Mr. Harris away?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No," Sarah said firmly, reaching over to pat his shoulder. "Mr. Harris hasn't done anything wrong. We won't let them take him." The kids exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. Mr. Harris had always been there for them, and now, in a strange twist, they felt it was their turn to be there for him. The atmosphere on the bus was thick with worry as the children watched through the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. They could see Mr. Harris standing on the side of the road, his usually worn face set in a firm expression as he spoke with the police officers. It was clear that the officers weren't just asking a few questions. They were questioning him in a harsh, almost accusing way. One officer pointed his finger at Mr. Harris, gesturing sharply and saying something the kids couldn't quite hear. But they saw Mr. Harris' shoulders tense up, his polite nodding replaced by a look of frustration he was clearly trying to hide. He stood there with his hands at his sides, his body still, trying to stay calm and respectful despite the officer's rough tone. Inside the bus, the kids' fear and confusion grew with every passing moment. They couldn't understand why Mr. Harris was being treated this way. To them, he was someone they trusted, someone who went out of his way to make each ride fun and safe. Seeing him face this kind of treatment didn't make any sense. They began to whisper to each other, trying to make sense of what was happening. A fifth grader named Jordan spoke up first, his voice a mix of anger and worry. "This isn't fair. Mr. Harris didn't do anything wrong. They're just being mean to him for no reason." Beside him, Sarah nodded, her face flushed with determination. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here and watch." She looked around at the other kids, her voice hushed but firm. "Mr. Harris would stand up for us. Now it's our turn to stand up for him." The younger children listened. Some were scared, others were unsure, but there was a spark of bravery spreading among them, a feeling of solidarity they couldn't ignore. They weren't entirely sure what they would do, but they knew they couldn't just stay silent. Just then, one of the officers turned and glanced at the bus, noticing the kids watching through the windows. His expression hardened as he looked back at Mr. Harris, saying something the kids couldn't hear. Mr. Harris glanced over his shoulder, meeting the eyes of his young passengers, and offered them a faint smile. A smile that tried to say, "It's okay, don't worry." But the kids could see through it. They could see the worry hidden in his eyes, the strain in his face. The officer stepped closer to Mr. Harris, his voice loud enough for the kids to catch some words. "You were driving erratically," he said, though his tone was more accusatory than informative. "We have a report about you speeding and failing to signal properly." The kids exchanged shocked looks. They knew Mr. Harris drove carefully. He always obeyed the rules, making safety his priority. They'd never seen him speed or miss a signal. Jordan clenched his fists, feeling the unfairness of it all bubbling inside him. It was wrong, and he knew it. Sarah leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. What if we showed them we're all on Mr. Harris's side? Maybe if they see us, they'll realize they're making a mistake. Her idea caught everyone's attention, and one by one, the kids nodded in agreement. They wanted to be brave, to stand up for Mr. Harris, even if they didn't know exactly what would happen next. Benji, who had been quiet up until then, pulled a notebook from his backpack and quickly started writing something in big, bold letters. He tore the paper out and held it up for everyone to see. It read, "We're with Mr. Harris." Another child, Mia, did the same, scribbling a quick note on the back of her math worksheet. This isn't fair. She held it up to the window, her small hands pressing it firmly against the glass. Soon, the other kids were rummaging through their bags, pulling out whatever paper they could find and writing messages of support. Their notes, written in a mixture of messy handwriting and colorful markers, carried messages like, "We stand with Mr. Harris," and "Stop bullying our driver." As each child held out their note, pressing it to the window, a strange silence settled outside. The officers glanced at the bus, noticing the signs and the determined faces of the young passengers. Their expressions changed, a flicker of surprise and unease crossing their faces as they took in the sight of dozens of little hands holding up messages, each one a bold declaration of support for their beloved driver. Inside the bus, the kids felt a rush of courage. They might not have understood everything about what was happening, but they knew enough. They knew Mr. Harris was a good person, and they weren't about to let him face this alone. They began tapping on the windows, their small hands beating a gentle but persistent rhythm, a silent plea for fairness. Mr. Harris looked back at the bus, his eyes growing misty as he saw the students' support. It was a sight he never expected. A group of young kids standing up for him with nothing more than a few pieces of paper and a lot of courage. His heart swelled with pride and gratitude, but also with a touch of worry. He didn't want them to get into trouble for standing up to the police, yet he couldn't help but feel a surge of strength from their brave show of unity. One of the officers sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he glanced from Mr. Harris to the bus, clearly uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of the children. The other officer, who had been speaking harshly to Mr. Harris, now looked visibly hesitant. He mumbled something to his partner, and the two stepped back, whispering to each other in low voices, their expressions shifting from authority to uncertainty. Seeing the officers retreat, if only for a moment, the kids cheered softly, their voices filled with both relief and excitement. They felt a sense of accomplishment, a belief that their support for Mr. Harris was making a difference. They had taken a stand, and it felt powerful. The officers, feeling the weight of the kids' united gaze, returned to Mr. Harris. Their tone was softer now, more businesslike and confrontational. They handed him back his identification, muttering something that sounded like an apology, though the kids couldn't hear it clearly. One officer cleared his throat, looking down at his notepad. "We'll let you off with a warning this time. Just make sure to follow all road safety rules." Mr. Harris nodded, his face calm, though a glimmer of relief softened his eyes. He thanked the officers, watching as they returned to their car. The tension began to lift, and inside the bus, the kids shared looks of triumph and pride. They had stood up together, and their voices, though silent, had been heard. Mr. Harris was standing by the police car, looking calm on the outside, but full of worry inside. The officers had become even sterner, their voices growing louder as they continued questioning him. Inside the bus, the children watched with wide, anxious eyes, feeling helpless and upset. They were sure their driver hadn't done anything wrong. All he ever did was look out for them, taking them to school safely every day, and treating them with kindness and respect. Now, it felt as if their friend, someone they trusted deeply, was in serious trouble. But just when it seemed like Mr. Harris might actually be taken away, the children's worry turned into something stronger, a fierce sense of courage and unity. Sarah, Jordan, Benji, and the others pressed their faces up against the windows, holding up their signs higher than before, each one a bold message of support. "We stand with Mr. Harris. This is unfair. Our driver is a good man." The messages were clear and strong, written in crayon and pencil on crumpled pieces of notebook paper. The words might have been simple, but the meaning behind them was powerful. The officers paused, their heads turning toward the bus as they noticed the signs held by dozens of small hands against the glass. They could see the determination on the children's faces, their eyes pleading for their voices to be heard. The kids weren't making any noise. They didn't have to. Their silent protest spoke louder than words. It was a stand for Mr. Harris, for the friendship and safety he offered them every day. Around them, a few cars had pulled over to see what was happening. Some passers-by had stopped on the sidewalk, watching the scene with curiosity and concern. The kids' display of unity and support was attracting attention, and soon enough, a small crowd was gathering, each person quietly observing what was unfolding. The officers glanced at each other, their faces showing a hint of discomfort. They hadn't expected an audience, especially not one full of children standing out for their driver. Their stern expressions began to falter, replaced by a mix of confusion and unease. Mr. Harris looked over at the bus, his heart swelling with emotion as he saw the signs and the determined faces of his young passengers. For a moment, he forgot all about the officers. His focus was entirely on his students, each one holding up a message of support. His eyes grew misty, and he swallowed hard, struggling to keep his composure. He never expected this kind of bravery from them. Never imagined they would take a stand for him in such a public and powerful way. Their support filled him with pride and gratitude, and he felt a wave of strength wash over him, making him stand taller and prouder than before. The officers shifted uncomfortably, now very aware of the crowd watching them and the unwavering gaze of the children. The situation felt different now, less about a traffic stop and more about the respect and trust between a driver and his young passengers. One officer cleared his throat, looking down at his notepad as if searching for something to say, while the other glanced nervously at the children's signs pressed against the bus windows. Finally, the officer holding Mr. Harris' identification hesitated, as if reconsidering a whole situation. He looked at Mr. Harris, then at the kids, and finally spoke in a quieter tone. "All right, we'll let you go with a warning this time. Just make sure to follow all traffic rules carefully," he said, though his voice lacked the previous harshness. The officer handed back Mr. Harris' identification, avoiding eye contact as he did so. The children saw this exchange through the window, and as soon as Mr. Harris received his ID back, they cheered softly, unable to contain their relief and happiness. It was a moment of triumph, one they would remember for a long time. They hadn't known if their signs and unity would make a difference, but somehow it had. They had stood up for Mr. Harris, and their voices, spoken without sound, but full of meaning, had been heard. Mr. Harris thanked the officers politely, even though his heart was pounding with a mixture of relief and pride. He turned and walked back toward the bus, and as he climbed the steps, the children erupted in applause and cheers. His eyes filled with tears he could no longer hold back, and he quickly wiped them away, laughing softly at his own emotion. He looked at each child, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you, kids," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you today. You all are the bravest little people I've ever known." The kids beamed back at him, some of them still holding their makeshift signs, others wiping away happy tears of their own. In that moment, the bond between them felt stronger than ever. They had stood up for what was right, for the person who had always looked out for them, and they knew they would do it all over again if they had to. As Mr. Harris started the engine and pulled back onto the road, the children settled back into their seats, each one feeling a little taller, a little braver. The bus was quiet now, But it was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful, satisfied quiet, as if everyone was reflecting on what they had just experienced together. They had seen something unfair, something that didn't sit right with them, and they had taken a stand, even when they didn't know how things would turn out. Mr. Harris glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of his young passengers, each one gazing out the window or looking at their signs with pride. A warm smile spread across his face, and he felt a profound sense of hope. These children, with their simple messages and unshakable courage, had reminded him that kindness and justice could come from anyone, even the youngest among them. By the time they pulled up to each stop, the kids couldn't stop talking about the experience, the moment they had stood together, united for their driver. Parents waiting at the stops noticed something different about their children as they climbed down the steps, a certain glow, a quiet pride in their eyes, and as each child walked away, they waved at Mr. Harris with a little more love, a little more respect than before. The bus continued down the road. Mr. Harris, still a bit overwhelmed by the day's events, knew one thing for sure. This was a story he would carry in his heart forever, a moment he would never forget. And for the kids, they had discovered a strength within themselves, a powerful lesson in standing up together for what's right, one that would shape them for years to come. If you enjoyed this story, please share and subscribe for more content.